A little girl walked into a biker bar holding a gun and asked the room for her father with the kind of calm that made the jukebox stop mid-song. That moment mattered because she had 3 days to prove a claim that could keep her out of state custody or send her into a system she feared. Maya Cruz, 9 years old, held the pistol with small, steady fingers and a folded photograph tucked into her palm like a promise. The room smelled of motor oil and stale coffee, neon light throwing blues over scarred faces, and the clink of glass sounded like a countdown. The men who ran the place were not strangers to trouble, but none of them expected a child to force their choices. Who in that crowded circle of leather and regret was her father, and what would that truth cost them all? They called themselves the Iron Saints, led by Jack Morales, a broad man with a laugh that had been broken in half by years of survival. Maya had walked past the posters and pool tables, past Rico who fixed bikes in the back, past Elena who kept the books and poured the beers, until she stood under the hanging lamp and spoke. A man named Tony reached for a pool cue, then froze when she showed the photo of a woman at a Christmas ride 9 years earlier with her arm around 5 bikers. Maya said the woman was her mother, Becca, and that Becca was in a hospital bed 2 towns over and had said one name before she lost consciousness. Marcus Reyes, a detective with a short temper and a badge that carried favors, had allegedly told Becca that custody would be messy, and the children with uncertain fathers often ended up in state homes. The accusation hung in the air like smoke. The proof in Maya's hand was thin and personal, and suddenly magnetic. The room murmured because they all remembered Becca, the rider who left town and never came back. Conversation flowed into a tight, tense exchange, as if the bar itself had become a courtroom. Jack said, "Put the gun down and let us talk." Maya said, "No one gets to touch it until she knows who to trust." Jack looked at Rico, then Elena, and then to Tony, and asked what she wanted from them. Maya said she wanted the truth about her father and to keep her mother out of an institution. Elena said, "Why would we risk that for you?" Maya said because Becca told her to follow her to the Saints if anything happened. Tony said that is dangerous. Marcus called it illegal, but grieving does strange things. Jack told Maya, "Tell us everything she told us, where she was born. Did you meet anyone?" She pointed to the photo and said the man with the faded tattoo on his wrist was the one who sang to her at a fair. Jake remembered the face and asked Maya to describe the tattoo exactly. Maya traced a circle with a line through it on the photo and said, "He sang a song about rivers." Jack sighed and said, "We owe Becca the truth, and we will find it." The Iron Saints mobilized in the way small communities move when a child is at stake. Names multiplied like a crowd at a rally. Besides Jack, Rico, Elena, and Tony, there were Snake, who ran security and checked pockets, Rosa, who worked the phones and collected favors, Luis, who kept a ledger of debts, and Razor, who drove and had a soft spot for lost kids. They gathered in a room in the back, the air thick with cigarette smoke and the smell of motor oil mixing with a stale sweetness of fried food. Elena opened Maya's photo again and held it to the light. The group debated quietly at first, then with voices climbing, piling recollections into a plan. "We need proof," said Rosa, "not just memory." Snake suggested asking the hospital for visitor logs. Tony insisted on a discreet check of registry records. Luis offered to find the man with the tattoo through old ride footage. The mood was concentrated, like mechanics leaning over an engine. They agreed to split tasks and to keep Marcus Reyes out of the loop as long as possible. The urgency sat in their chests like a hot weight. They were not saints in any official sense, but they had a code, and it included protection. If you are feeling a mix of anger and hope right now, you are not alone. Tell us in the comments if you would trust strangers who wear leather to keep a child safe, or if you would hand her to authorities. Start your comment with "I would protect" or "I would be cautious" so others can see the range of answers. Your voice matters because communities make their own choices when institutions falter. These conversations show how people judge risk and loyalty in real time, and they can change how we think about protection. Now back to the story. While the saints were gathering proof, the clock kept ticking for Maya and her mother. Conditions by people outside the system follow different rules. The saints scoured old ride photos, called contacts at the charity that had helped Becca years earlier, and asked for ride lists from a trustee named Ramon, who ran a supply shop downtown. Elena used social media to cross-reference faces. Rosa made discreet calls to a nurse at the county hospital, and Razor drove into neighborhoods where old members congregated. They uncovered a registry entry from 9 years earlier showing Becca visiting a man listed as Antonio Cruz. A nurse named Dr. Kim had written a note about a visitor with a tattoo at the wrist. The group compiled a folder of leads, and a single piece of potentially decisive evidence surfaced: a shaky phone video taken at a charity ride showing a man with a faded circle tattoo on his wrist putting his arm around Becca and laughing. The saints gathered around a phone in low light, hands passing the device like a relic. The clip smelled like dust and rain from an old camera and carried the faint sound of faraway engines. A technical step became necessary. They agreed to make a verified copy and preserve the original file in a secure chain of custody to keep it admissible should they need it later. That procedure would mean logging metadata, noting the file's origin and transfer times, and storing the original on an encrypted drive until it could be handed to a pro bono lawyer or the district attorney under formal chain of custody rules. Snake said, "Get a copy and make sure not to alter anything," Elena said. "I will document every hand it changes," Rico said. "I can match the time and place from my ledger." Rosa said, "I will call Ramon for confirmation." Razor said, "I will try to find the man with the tattoo." Tony said, "I will watch the hospital list." Jack said, "We have to protect Maya while we do this." Maya hugged the photograph and asked, "What if the man does not want to be found?" Elena said, "Then we will make the truth louder." Snake said, "We are not going to let a detective like Marcus decide a child's fate again." Tony said, "Marcus has influence at the shelter, and that is why we have to move fast." Rico said, "If we find him, we confront him in public." Jack said, "No violence unless it is the only way to stop harm." Rosa said, "I will talk to Becca's nurse." Lewis said, "I will check old parole lists." Razor said, "I will drive Maya to the hospital if they let her in," and that is the plan. They moved with precise loyalty. Tension rose when Marcus Reyes came into focus, not as rumor but as an obstacle. He was a detective who liked tidy answers and reported that he had the authority to arrange protective custody when a parent could not care for a child. He had been photographed with a councilman at a charity event, and his name carried weight in the courthouse. The saints knew that if Marcus convinced the hospital or the guardian office that Maya's claim was unstable, they would lose their window. A confrontation became inevitable. The first heated exchange happened outside the hospital, where Jack, Elena, Snake, Rico, and Maya waited, while Marcus approached in a suit that still smelled faintly of aftershave and powder. The verbal fight was precise and edged with the threat of badges and complaints. Marcus said, "You cannot just bring a child with a gun into a public place and make claims." Jack said, "You cannot use your title to yank a child from her mother without proof."
Marcus said, "I am doing what is legal and in the child's best interest." Elena said, "The law does not always mean safety for this child." Marcus said, "Then bring me the proof." Jack said, "We have a video and witness logs." Marcus narrowed his eyes and said, "Evidence has to be verified in court and not by vigilantes." Rico said, "Since when did saving someone become a crime?" Marcus said, "Since illicit methods threaten chain of custody and the integrity of an investigation." Snake said, "The integrity of an investigation does not protect a dying woman." Jack said, "We will go to court if we must, but we will protect her now." The revelation that shifted everything was simple and unexpected. Becca blinked and, in a voice thin with fever, mouthed the name Antonio. The nurse, Elena, and Rosa were with her and recorded the utterance on a hospital phone after gaining permission to note the words in her chart. The footage was grainy and fragile, but it was a direct identification, and it contradicted the neat narrative Marcus sought to impose. At the same time, Razor returned from a search with a witness, an older rider named Luis Lopez, who had been at the charity ride and who recognized the man with the circle tattoo as Antonio Cruz, then a delivery rider who had drifted into the Saints years ago. Luis came forward and gave a sworn note. The combined weight of a recorded hospital note and a witness who would testify in open court made the case differently complicated. In a small back alley confrontation with Antonio, he denied paternity and shouted that he had been misremembered, then reached for his pocket as if to pull a cigarette. Jack moved like a man who had learned timing from bikes, and people fell silent. A non-lethal shot rang out, a warning more than an attack, splitting the night air, a sound as sharp as the decision it marked. The attendees gasped, the bedlam of the moment folding into a new, brittle quiet that smelled of gunpowder and winter. The first tension paragraph. After the shot, everyone froze because the room had to decide whether to escalate. Maya clutched the photograph and felt her heartbeat like a drum in her throat. Faces turned from anger to fear to resolve, and they realized the line between protection and law was thinner than they had hoped. The second tension paragraph. Marcus used the noise to claim authority and called for backup, saying the presence of a firearm meant custody protocol must kick in. Jack looked at Maya and then at the hospital corridor and made a choice that would define the next hours. He stepped forward and offered himself and the Saints as temporary custodians to keep Maya away from a system they did not trust until a court could decide. The moment hung like a scale, each choice heavy with consequence. Legal steps followed with the speed and sudden slowness of institutions. Officers arrived and placed both witnesses and veterans at a perimeter, while paperwork began. A pro bono attorney named Claire Santos agreed to take Maya's case and file an emergency petition for temporary custody, with the juvenile court citing imminent harm and Becca's recorded utterance as evidence. The technical chain of custody for the video required documentation. The Saints logged who handled the file, when, and how it was copied. They wrote timestamps, filled out transfer forms, created hash verifications, and stored the original on an encrypted drive with access logs. The district attorney's office assigned an intake specialist named Kelly, who promised to review the materials. Marcus tried to assert his influence to have Maya placed with the county shelter, but Claire argued that the presence of community guardianship and corroborating evidence made temporary kinship a safer option. The hospital social worker, a woman named Dr. Patel, reluctantly agreed to a temporary hold that allowed the Saints supervised custody while formal hearings were scheduled. The legal machinery creaked but moved toward a pragmatic stopgap as people negotiated custody, testimony, and the admissibility of the hospital recording. Jack said, "We will hand over everything to the court." Claire said, "We will file papers tomorrow." Marcus said, "I still want a full investigation." Elena said, "Then investigate properly." Tony said, "Do not take Maya away." Snake said, "We will stand by the paperwork." Claire said, "Everyone who handled the evidence must sign an affidavit." Rosa said, "I will write a statement." Luis said, "I will testify." Razor said, "I will bring the ride footage." Jack said, "Protect the child and keep the peace." Marcus said, "I am only following protocol." Jack said, "Then follow justice too."
In private, Maya faced the pile of choices she had carried like stones in a backpack. A backstory unfolded in 2 parts that explained why she had come alone to a bar. The first paragraph of backstory. Maya had grown up in a cramped trailer park on the edge of town, where her mother Becca worked double shifts in a clinic and sometimes disappeared for weeks on charity rides that kept her sense of purpose alive. Maya had learned early that being small meant watching and remembering details others forgot. The curl in a laugh, the way a tattooed wrist moved when someone waved. She had loved the nights Becca returned, the way the scent of oil and sweet tobacco braided with cinnamon rolls and strange loud music. The second paragraph of backstory. An event 9 years earlier had split their lives when Becca left with riders after a winter aid run and did not come back for months. Rumors grew, court notices arrived, and the county at one point threatened to take Maya into a shelter when Becca became hospitalized and verbal identification was unreliable. Becca had whispered before losing consciousness that Maya should find the riders if anything happened, and that whoever recognized them would be a
Kind of family. Those whispered instructions became Maya's compass, and the reason she had walked into that bar with a weapon, not to threaten, but to force attention to a truth she feared the system would ignore. The family decision came down to a formal but fragile compromise. The juvenile court scheduled an emergency hearing, and Claire argued for temporary custody to be granted to Jack and a designated guardian group on the condition they submit to supervised visits and baseline checks. The court named Jack as a temporary custodian and ordered the Saints to allow monitored access by the county and to deposit the evidence with the court clerk for review. Maya sat at the table in a small conference room with Jack and Claire and Dr. Patel. She listened as the judge's clerk read the order aloud. Tears mingled with relief, and the practicalities of the ruling were spelled out. Supervised custody pending DNA and testimony, mandatory check-ins with the social worker, and a timetable for a full hearing in 30 days. The choice meant Maya would not be placed in state care immediately, and that Becca's claim could be tested. Jack promised to treat the role as a duty and not a glory. He presented an old leather patch he had kept for years and offered it as a symbol of the promise they were making to Maya. She accepted the patch with the small solemnity of a child who had learned the weight of symbols. Months later, the epilogue showed concrete changes. 1 month after the hearing, Maya had moved into a small apartment above the garage where Elena cooked and made sure she did homework. Razor taught her basic bike maintenance, and Rosa visited with takeout, each small routine a layer of normalcy. The hospital had initiated an internal review after the recorded identification, and a nurse named Marcus's later complaint resulted in an administrative inquiry into how custody recommendations had been made. 3 months in, the district attorney filed charges against a social worker who had been trading favors and investigating the shelter procedures. Public records showed a sudden uptick in oversight and a new protocol requiring third-party verification before custody transfers. 6 months after that, a formal DNA test returned a partial match, linking Antonio Cruz to Maya through a mitochondrial marker that required further verification but could not be dismissed. The chain of custody documents Claire had insisted on allowed the video and hospital recording to be admitted as corroborating evidence. The court ordered supervised visitation with Antonio pending the full hearing. The bar where the Saints had met now displayed a small wooden plaque with the name and the leather patch Jack had given to Maya hung above the door as a symbol of the night a community chose to act rather than stand by. Becca was in recovery and had begun family therapy with Claire's help. The conclusion tightened the thread into meaning.
Maya had walked into a room with a gun and left with a different kind of protection, one built from imperfect people who chose responsibility over indifference. Legal consequences followed, reforms began, and messy alliances formed into a literal temporary family. The photograph she carried became framed on the wall of Elena's kitchen, and the patch became a reminder that guardianship can be chosen as well as inherited.
Family was remade in public records and in quiet kitchens. If this story moved you and you want to hear more about ordinary people standing up when institutions fail, subscribe to the channel. We share documents, interviews, and the steps people took when the system stumbled, so you can see how protection can be built in neighborhoods and not just courtrooms. Remember that sometimes justice comes from unlikely places, and family is often chosen by those who will protect you when it matters most.